Welcome to the Magic Dance, the sublime Thinley Norbu Rinpoche's work, which very much presents the foundation of the Vajrayana view, and as such, it's also titled "The Display of the Self-Nature of the Five Wisdom Dakinis." And I think it's rather important that I emphasize how odd I am presenting a work like this. This is definitely never a question of, as somebody who does, you could say, presentations of Dharma, that this becomes routine. There's always a certain degree of awe, intrepidation, concern really of doing justice to the subject matter. And as always, I have to emphasize how important it is for this really to work. that you actually read this. Again, I must emphasize this is really not a digest of or pretending to be any kind of, you could say, summary or even representative of Thinley Norbu Rinpoche's work. It comes from a place of great joy that such a marvelous writing exists and wishing to share it. But it is very much premised on that we're all reading this together. Anyway, that said, very happy to be here. And as always, we should really consider how engaging in this kind of study is intended to inform our practice. And this combination of having a clear perspective and knowing what to do in terms of integration should really be permeated by this awareness of the suffering that there is in the world and the wish to be of service to others through the insights that we gain with our study and practice. So we'll begin. Energy and power. An intelligent person can benefit from others without hurting them, like a bee can sip nectar from a flower without harming it. In the Buddhist teaching, we emphasize non-violence in the sense of non-aggression. And this comes from the fact that aggression is not needed in reality. Sometimes we need to be assertive, but if our actions really come from a place of awareness, then it's really just about plugging the holes the right places and just being present the way that it's needed. And as such, it's never a question of our actions ever harming anyone. A bodhisattva's actions never harm anybody. And so we interact with the world from a perspective that recognizes the nature of the world as extending beyond just us. It's not just us in this world. And that wider perspective that prompts a respect, an awareness, and a non-aggression. So Thinley Norbu Rinpoche at the beginning of the chapter then writes, from the beginning, the subtle and gross energy of our elements is inseparable from emptiness. When we express ourselves excessively with excitement, we exaggerate our gross element energy and depress our subtle element energy. As a result, our energy is directed predominantly towards substance, and its natural connection to emptiness is obscured. Because substance is impermanent, when new circumstances arise and the substance object of our excited energy changes or is lost, our energy is also lost, and we feel anxious and depressed. In this way, our energy is like a river and has a natural flow. If a river's energy is excessive, it will flood. Afterwards, when its flood energy has been exhausted, a ruin is left behind. If we let our gross energy flood, we get tired easily because our mind loses its subtle energy support. If through skillful means, we're able to conserve subtle energy by expressing it carefully in small amounts with pauses, then it is temporarily good for our health and mood, whether we are alone or with people, and eventually a benefit to us as we get older. So our engagement with the world needs to be founded on properly relating to the world and not retreating into what we would like to think of our version of the world, our agendas in terms of the world, and rather we need to understand the nature of our world. And we fail in this regard when we only fixate on appearances, and we fail to understand the true nature of our reality, which is empty. Of course, us in the modern world, we're brought up within a culture that only, or rather, we're brought up in a culture where the science that very often is revered as the only authentic source of truthful understanding of our world, where that exclusively focuses on what is material. And the whole science, the need for the laws, the need for the direction, the need for this skillful engagement with everything that is not apparent, that is not material, that is not tangible, all that which is invisible and yet which governs our lives, that is left to circumstance, left to the individual to navigate. And as such, we have a very narrow, confined science that prides itself on being empirical, of being evidence-based, but really only fixates on what is material, when what is not material is equally evident, is equally experienced, if not more, because everything that we perceive as solid material reality is perceived through a consciousness. So leaving that invisible factor without any proper science, without proper knowledge, and very often relegating it to spheres of, well, essentially relegating all the various attempts there is as understanding this invisible dimension, what we have in religion, what we have in spiritual path, and so on. Basically, constituting a popular discourse that dismisses this as either ignorant or based on belief systems and so on, it actually ends up having the modern person is very poorly equipped to actually properly understand the nature of reality. So that's where the Buddha comes in while we're watching this movie of our reality and says, you know, it's just a movie. It doesn't have that reality that we attribute to it. And that's where the Buddha introduces emptiness. That's where the Buddha is not saying there's nothing there, but the Buddha is saying it doesn't have that solidity. And that's where we introduce a dimension that lies beyond what we ordinarily conceive of. And this is the Buddha's teaching on dependent arising, on wisdom, on emptiness. And it's on the basis of this insight that we then begin to have a clear, sane relationship to the phenomenal world and ourselves. And that is where we need to understand the nature of our reality is this unity of what is apparent, yes, but also doesn't have any inherent true existence. So that's where we talk about the unity of appearance, sorry, the unity of emptiness and appearances. Now, when we fail to recognize that, then we get caught up in our objectification, fixation on the gross elements, and we fail actually to administrate and be in touch with the subtle energy behind. And that's where we end up with this flood situation that we might get excited or we might get overwhelmed and whatever, and it leaves us depressed, anxious, because we're simply not in touch with reality. So that's where it's not just a question of, you could say, navigating this intelligently. It's simply just that we're out of touch. And not understanding emptiness, we're out of touch. So this is not a, you could say, categorical chauvinistic Buddhist statement. It's something we can verify for ourselves. If we're out of touch, if we lack awareness, perspective, then we always fail. We can see this in an ordinary way, but we can also see this on the basis of being practitioners of meditation. So that's where we need skillful means to conserve our energy, and that's where we need to have a spiritual path. That's where we need to have a spiritual path that we cultivate in meditation and that we also apply in post-meditation. Some of you hopefully had the opportunity to see Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche today talk with Daniel Atkins in the context of wisdom publications. And Rinpoche emphasizing really when it comes to practice, we need to equally emphasize meditation and post-meditation. That's where we need to have these skillful means to conserve our energy. So that's also where we needn't waste our energy. Thinley Norbu Rinpoche used to scold his students for blurting, using too much energy in their speech. Some of Rinpoche's students were very beautiful talkers, but Rinpoche very kindly attended to the fact that they had excessive speech. Really isn't skillful, really isn't communicating. It is in fact just blurting. That's a word he used to use. Anyway, Rinpoche says, according to worldly custom, when we make plans for business or try to organize our life, it is best to keep energy contained without expressing it until we get results. According to Dharma custom, it is also best to keep our energy contained until we develop confidence. That way, even if the result does not come immediately, our energy will not be dissipated and exhausted. Now, we've spoken about this phenomenon of the gross and subtle elements. And subtle elements we sometimes refer to as the dimension of our psychology. And that's why we could say it's invisible. Our psychology is invisible. And yet it becomes, what is present becomes very, what is happening in our psychology becomes visible, becomes evident under particular circumstances. So if we're particularly stressed and then circumstances aggravate this, then the inner stress manifests in terms of more conspicuous aspects of our body and our voice. Likewise, also if we're at ease and possibly difficult circumstances manifest, then we very often can be constructive, creative, insightful, resourceful in dealing with these. So the inner invisible becomes visible on the basis of circumstances. Sublime beings, they very often know what's happening with others, even when there's not circumstances that bring these out. Sublime beings have just a sense of, you could say, awareness that picks up on the subtle messages and also possibly dimensions that we're not normally privy to in terms of seeing or being sensitive to what is being thought. We very often have examples where great masters, sublime beings, they know what we're thinking. And this we have in the Buddhist tradition, but it's also something that is spoken about and not uncommon beyond Buddhist cultures, obviously. In terms of our energy and power, if our mind is left in, actually the Tibetan have a very interesting word called lumaten, which means not really directed, not really, you could say, accounted for. It's really just when we're in neutral mode, essentially mindless. So there might not be a lot happening. We might even think we're in some sort of spiritual, peaceful realm, but it's really just a mindless condition. It could go anywhere. It's essentially undirected. Once we have direction, then there's a purpose, then the mind is sharp, and this rallies the energy of the body and the energy, the subtle energies of our prana mind. So that's where the aim, and particularly, of course, we're talking about spiritual practice here. Then when we are mindful of our spiritual practice, then this brings energy and power. So we can concentrate on the subtle elements. Rinpoche gives the example of if we're cold, then focusing on the heat element, then that increases just thinking, directing the mind to the heat element, or the fire element, then this generates heat. If we're hot, directing the towards the water element, this cools down. And this is also the mind, something that we in the somatic. The way that we direct our mind affects our body. We can also see how our body, so that's where impact in terms of how we are physically as well. If we are directing our mind and we direct ourselves to really just the gross and the obvious, yes, then we have possibly results in terms of if we're fixating on just gross circumstances in terms of the material, then yes, then we might achieve that. But failing to really to understand the subtle, invisible aspects, then we really just have very limited results that exhaust pretty quickly. So we can extend the domain of our power over others with the impure intention to harm, and it will exhaust. So we might have some power where we possibly manipulate and overwhelm and achieve our agenda. But because this is very much tied up with a narrow state of mind, a limited state of mind, then the value of this rarely persists very, very long and very, very quickly exhausts and often doesn't really bring much benefit neither to oneself nor to others. However, if conversely we embrace others with pure intention to benefit, then we're engaging much vaster and much more powerful aspect of our mind. And this is what Rinpoche gives the example of leaders. For example, Mahatma Gandhi, who in a great way was able to, on the basis of pure intention, to really impact in a very large way. So that's where this is what leads to or rather, this is what constitutes really the path of the Bodhisattva, the great power to benefit. This is something that we can do over at a distance. Sometimes there's how do you say, therapeutic modalities that work with others' energy and power at a distance. And so we have this invisible dimension of you could say, impacting beyond just the immediate vicinity of where we are. But also when we sometimes come across then the energy of others, negative energy of others, then very often we generate patterns of negativity on the basis of us regurgitating negative narratives, fears, anxieties, and so on. So rather than do that, then in fact we should operate with antidotes, making bodhisattva prayers, practicing mantra, practicing aspirations, and so on. So when we have this kind of armor, then we're not so easily disturbed by others. And even if others might have some, you could say, circumstantial temporary power, we could actually benefit them beyond just the sort of the immediate obvious harm that they might be you could say extending over others. So that's where when we interact with others, we can work with visualizations, we can work with directing our mind, directing our energy, engaging in practice. particularly then Rinpoche says when we have conditions where possibly on the basis of also external circumstances where we might not be sleeping well, then we can also use antidotes such as visualization practices. There's a number of practices that we can do when, when we can't sleep, anything from the breath and so on, but also to the practices that we have in the completion stage practices with radiating and reabsorbing of light, merging the guru within ourselves, and so forth. Now, when it comes to power, then there's two kinds. And if we look at the news and if we open the newspapers or the apps for news and so on, then we encounter that which tends to sort of drive the world, and also what seems to drive our perception of the world, which is simply just awareness of ordinary intellectual power, which, because by definition, it's limited to self-centering. However, some might have more self-centered, some might have less, some might be overtly toxic, some might be, you could say, less, and some might even have beneficial wishes for others, but still they're held back and hampered by dualistic clinging, the delusional belief in self and other, and so forth. And that's where inevitably ordinary intellectual power, ordinary mind power is narrow and predominantly is geared towards the causes of suffering. It's heavy. Noble intelligent power, which is then what we associate with the practice of the path, and that is the very nature of the practice of Dharma, is to generate that. That is then powerful in that it's deep, clear, and vast, in that it connects with what is real, it connects with that which is no longer hampered by and held by, limited by dualistic fixation. And even if there is dualistic fixation, then there's already a vision of that which lies beyond duality. And there is an engagement in, you could say, the trainings of the mind, such as compassion, kindness, and also the yogas, such as pure perception. So that's why we have two ways in which we can identify ordinary intellectual power and noble intelligent power. And that's why we could say, well, there's these persons, they're ordinary intellectual, and those persons, they're noble intelligent. That's not really the Rinpoche's point. Rinpoche doesn't mention this so that we all of a sudden begin to be judgmental. It's good to navigate, but above all, it's a message to ourselves that we, within ourselves, we have ordinary intellectual power, speaking for myself a lot of the time, and yet there is an alternative, which is then noble intelligent power. So it's you could say it's Rinpoche is encouraging us to cultivate the latter. But doing so in a, you could say, very inoffensive way. Rinpoche very often skillfully just talks about it as if, this is what you have. You have some people doing like this, you have some people doing like that, but a lot of, it has a lot to do with ourselves, message to ourselves. So he says, noble, intelligent people do not use or accept ordinary intellectual power because it is too small and too narrow, too shallow and too rigid, too one-sided and too fixed in time for them. If we accept ordinary power, our minds cannot be vast. Without a vast mind, there can be no great power, and only with great power can we adapt to the many different faculties among individual beings and act in time, grow in time, release in time, help in time, and develop in time. So for us to benefit others on the relative level, where we are constrained by the perceptions of time and space, then we need this vastness of noble, intelligent power. If we're just tagging along with habitual, ordinary intellectual power, then we're constructing ourselves in too narrow a way, and we won't really be of much use for anybody. Now, we very often hear that people would like to go beyond systems, and they might even think the Buddha was wonderful, but sadly, Buddhism, the message of the Buddha has been corrupted by the institution of Buddhism. And so there's a general sort of wariness about isms, justifiably. But the thing is, if any kind of communication is going to take place within the human realm, it necessarily has to go through language. And if it's going to reach anybody, there has to be some structure in order to reach beyond just a very limited audience. So there has to be some systems in place. And when something works, then the word of mouth and the word is out there, then others follow. And so whatever you choose to call it, there's a ripple effect that inevitably results in particular practical structures. And these are indispensable. They are expressions of compassion, really. Without that, then the sage could, he or she could just retreat into isolation and not be of any benefit to anybody. So Rinpoche says, or Rinpoche doesn't say that, but I'm sort of just my point here in terms of what Rinpoche is stating in the book is that spiritual groups necessarily rely on tradition and social customs. But it's important that these don't become ends in themselves. And so we should understand that these conventions of tradition and social customs, they're only temporary devices. So for those with ordinary intellectual power, these institutions can become a vehicle of misuse. And this is what we then see in Dharma groups when there is ordinary persons who have personal ambitions. Of course, it's very difficult for persons right away to snap into being saintly, to snap into sainthood right away. So it's generally a mixed bag. But this tendency really is what can pollute the atmosphere. And if it's left, or rather, unless these persons actually are onto it themselves, or we are onto it ourselves, then actually this pollutes the atmosphere and it creates heavy hierarchical energy. This we very often see when we have organizations in which, spiritual organizations in which the teacher is seen as a god, and the administration sees then those who are following the teacher, sees them as rather a pain. And they're sort of more seen as demons. So there's the God, which is the guru, and then you have the Sangha, which is seen as demons. And that's where there is this hierarchy where then persons who are involved with these institutions, they might very often be very respectful towards the teacher and lack respect for those that really are there to be served. So these institutions, there's a danger this can happen. At the same time also, within these institutions, and that's not where the institution is, you could say, absolute. Regardless of what happens in the institution, if there is a structure in which a student can meet with the teacher, then regardless of that, there might be persons who are driven by this ordinary intellectual power and who are perpetrating this heavy hierarchical energy. Regardless, persons can connect with the teacher, so that it needn't be an absolute impediment. It can sometimes be a bit of an impediment, but it's really up to the individual practitioner to deal with that. And that's where we could say these institutions, imperfect as they might be, they can enable connecting with this natural, pure, vast luminosity. Okay, excuse me, I'm having some I'm just gonna just a sec. Okay. So that's where we are grateful to these institutions, that actually we have a place in which we can engage with this purity, and that is possible for somebody who then comes with respectful intention. So that's where, again and again, in the PIS instructions of great masters, they see, have pure view of all the teachers and have pure view of all the individual practitioners. Rinpoche says, people with ordinary minds who try to catch the minds of those of a higher level have respectful intention, not evolutionary intention. If our mind's intention connect with natural, pure, vast luminosity power by outwardly depending on social custom, while inwardly depending on the pure light essence of the elements, we can create purer and greater energy. So I have to confess, I'm a little bit wobbly with regards to the Rinpoche's choice of word here, not evolutionary intention. I think he either is referring to something that is tainted by ambition, or else the notion of something gradual, because beyond the gradual process of, you could say, an evolutionary development on the path, a mind which is open and has respect can actually immediately perceive and connect with this pure, vast luminosity power. And it's in that context then that the external, you could say, gestures, we'll look at this later on, but the external gestures of the social conventions, such as bowing down, extending, you could say, courtesies, making offerings, and in general, you could say, abiding by social customs, at the same time also having that sensitivity to the purity and the wisdom, the freedom of the teacher, then there is the ability to immediately connect with purer and greater energy. Rinpoche says, even if we only use ordinary intellectual power, when we meet with people who use pure, noble, intelligent power, we automatically get a sense of expansiveness rather than one of rejection or confinement to a lower level. In this way, some pure and gifted meditators create a field of bliss around themselves through their spontaneous, luminous power, and use their pure elements to help others attain the same level and join with them in the same mandala and same mind. So even ordinary individuals will be able to connect with sublime individuals on the basis of respect, openness, devotion, etc. And that's where something lifts, and that's where a great being can lift ordinary persons into a field that is no longer contaminated by the ordinary confusion and kleshas, and there's a field of bliss around such persons. I sometimes visited Rinpoche's house in Jopati in Kathmandu, and even Rinpoche wasn't there. Downstairs, he would be upstairs. Even if he wasn't in the room, there would be a palpable quality of wakefulness, even if it was just quiet and not much was happening. The mere fact of being in this house, I used to think even the walls, they somehow radiated this quality of. Rinpoche was very intense, and there would be this field, as Rinpoche is describing here, really, there would be this literally a field of bliss that was palpable even within the apparently solid, you would say, structure of the walls and the furniture and so on. Okay, there was a question. Do definitions always depend on self? If there is no self, there will be no definition. Yeah, possibly, but it's a bit speculative, isn't it? Since we do have a self. So for the time being, we do very much operate with definitions. Yeah. So you could say the ultimate nature of reality, there's no concepts, but presently we are rather uh, we're rather engaged with, and you could say entangled with concepts. We're entangled in confusion, and as such we do experience self and other, and that's where we do also operate with concepts such as definitions. Yeah. Respect. I bow and pay homage to secret, stainless, all noble wisdom land. Paying homage is something very beautiful because it externally appears to be hierarchical, dualistic, and in fact, it ultimately is about dissolving that. The moment that we recognize an object of respect, such as the all-noble dimension of wisdom, the moment that we recognize that, there's a deep appreciation that expresses itself in a sense of wonder. And that's where naturally we would join our hands, possibly, Anjali Mudra, we might bow. And there's overall a sense of that which is sacred, that's beyond the ordinary, you could say, stains of confusion. That's where we then are in a place where we externalize this sacred dimension, and the skillful means in this situation is not just to say, well, presently I have a dualistic condition, and so I should be in the non-dualistic condition. That would be extremely unskillful and frustrating. And that's where we accommodate the dualistic condition through bowing. But that bowing is not something that perpetuates and furthers the dualistic, because that moment that we express an appreciation for that which is beyond, then we are connecting with it. The moment that we actually just sit down and think non-duality, 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 then we're actually not integrating the reality of our present experience. Whereas if we can integrate this present experience, that's what we call skillful means. And that's where bowing becomes that which connects us to that which is beyond duality, that which is beyond, you could say, external gestures of homage. Rinpoche says, the essence of all manners and politeness is respect. In ancient times, when pure inner qualities were naturally respected and considered most noble, people became kings, queens, and aristocrats through their pure essence, politeness, and manners. Their natural integrity was respected by people with pure minds, so they held this pure custom lineage for many generations, no matter how their circumstances changed. Our natural nobility essence is pure from the beginning, but in modern times, our inner elements have become obstructed and are not so subtly refined. So we can no longer connect with our natural nobility lineage. Instead, we attach to impermanent gross circumstances, and when these circumstances change, our behavior often becomes gross, arrogant, and fickle. True nobility is like gold, which is always unchanged by circumstances. Even if you burn it, it is still gold. Even if you cut it, it is still gold. Even if you grind it, it is still gold. So we can identify this, which corresponds a little bit like the French. They have this saying, noblesse oblige. Nobility obliges you to, you could say, raise your level, so to speak. You have to step up. And that's where nobility, which sometimes is constructed as some sort of hierarchical institutions that's to be brought down on the basis of the, the tall poppy approach, where there's this sort of misunderstood egalitarian agenda of we're all equal and hence nobody should ever be respected more than others. This is a bit a misunderstanding. There is something that truly permeates universally and is vividly manifest in individuals when there is this nobility or this quality in humans, then it's quite visible. And Rinpoche is describing how then in the past, even this being so visible, these were the persons who were elected leaders. It's a little bit comical nowadays when leading up to election, leaders who really just are not much more than just economists and power-hungry manipulators. They pretend to be bodhisattvas, and they say all the right things in terms of what you'd really want to think was on the inside. You'd wish, but it's sadly very often only too transparent that it's not really, you could say, a genuine qualities. But there is a recognition of these genuine qualities, and actually led me to I hope this is a little bit of an aside, but there is this this quote from Ian Foster that I always anyway this brought to mind, and I'll just read it. It's from something he wrote called Two Cheers for Democracy. This is entirely non-Buddhist, so but it reflects a little bit of the same. He says, I believe in aristocracy, though, if that is the right word, and if a Democrat may use it. Not an aristocracy of power based upon rank and influence, but an aristocracy of the sensitive, the considerate, and the plucky. Its members are to be found in all nations and classes, and all through the ages. And there is a secret understanding between them when they meet. They represent the true human tradition, the one permanent victory of our queer race over cruelty and chaos. Thousands of them perish in obscurity. A few are great names. They are sensitive for others as well as for themselves. They are considerate without being fussy. Their pluck is not swankiness, but the power to endure. And they can take a joke. So I praise myself very fortunate also beyond my exposure, my fortune to meet very Buddhist teachers, to have met people like this just when I grew up, just in ordinary circumstances. Anyway, this quality, if it really is deep and genuine and we're not seduced just by the superficial, then that kind of unchanging nobility, Rinpoche actually says this necessarily comes from past lives, from previous karmic dispositions. What happens is sometimes that there is an artificial attempt where we say, lacking deep respect of society's pure essence and stuck on the gross, power gets misused by artificial, unreliable nobility. And that is, like I was saying before, what we very often have when people who really are just interested in temporal power, they pretend to have some sort of artificial nobility. And that has nothing to do really with the, you could say, the core of these values. They actually exist a little bit like Kant would call it the categorical imperative. There is something which is truly what we must do. And that lies at the core of the societal values that very often we operate with. Decency, the notion of decency, honesty, and so forth. But these you could say pure elements, they're very often just negotiated and essentially just seen as they're assumed to be there, but very often they're not lived by. And that's where very often there's just lip service paid to them, artificial lip service that in fact has nothing to do with these qualities themselves, but rather everything to do with worldly ambition. So genuine aristocracy is sometimes conflated with false aristocracy on the basis of cultural background. So this happens sometimes in modern democracies where, and also in places where, like Rinpoche is saying, places that are poverty stricken and where there is sort of a social, very often a socialist sort of attitude that nobody should think that they're anything special. And if there's somebody who has really noble qualities, they might actually be, you could say, misperceived as being misperceived and not understood. And that's really just because there's a fear of individuals that are outstanding. If there's somebody who genuinely is good and noble, it might just be misunderstood. Very often in the modern, speedy, technocratic cultures like we have presently, then there's so little emphasis on actually learning respect. It's all about information. It's all about functionality and success in terms of the gross, in terms of the superficial aspects of power and functioning and so on. And there's not really a emphasis or an ability or time to actually learn the qualities of respect in the sense of non-aggression, in the sense of appreciating that which is unseen, invisible, and sublime. And the thing is, like also I was saying before, everyone appreciates the value of such noble qualities. And so we all have that. In general, in secular context, there is an appreciation for these kind of noble qualities, these sort of, Kantian ideals of what necessarily we should be like. And that's where then the leaders, or rather when we look for leaders, this is what we look for. So that's where we need to recognize that the short benefits that we might get just from the gross and the material, which of course is, that's natural. We sort of have an idea of sort of let's say the pyramid of our needs, that necessarily we need to have the foundations of the material and so forth in place. Yet, without really that being permeated by genuine value, then we actually, we don't really have much genuine happiness at all. So that's where there's a lack. Where there's this focus on the material, we lack that which really matters, which is the spiritual. Rinpoche says, when we have material habits, we only respect what we can use while we are using it. If we see sublime people, we may only respect them temporarily, but not deeply and unchangeably from our hearts. We cannot appreciate or benefit from their spiritual qualities because we see them from a substance point of view for our own entertainment. Our mind becomes more and more stuck in the artificial and inert objects of our concern, so we're unable to connect with their true essence. But if our aim is enlightenment, we must respect sublime people with spiritual qualities and depend on them to sharpen our faculties. So sometimes we see how people who are genuinely sublime persons, they become, you'd say, the object of entertainment. They become celebrities. Leaders might want to be photographed together with such persons. They might want to associate with them, but that's really only for a very short-lived or for a very short-sighted agenda, purpose. But if we are on the path to enlightenment, then our association with these kind of people necessarily needs to be, our engagement with them necessarily needs to come from a place of a deep, deep respect and appreciation for these sublime qualities that they possess. Everything really else becomes secondary. So Rinpoche says, from the worldly point of view, the true purpose of respect is to show that culture and tradition are precious and to become knowledgeable and venerable by recognizing their precious qualities. So that's where we, in various cultures, we have this sort of idea of our culture, our cultural identity, and our cultural value, etc., etc. But these are only very, you could say, narrow concerns compared to the concerns of enlightenment. They're there and they constitute some very pure and some very pure qualities that become the causes of happiness, but not necessarily enlightenment. So that's where there's why we refer to it as worldly, is because it's not beyond the world. It's within the world and it creates a lot of good conditions for the world. And that's also why they're part of, you say, the package of societies that we celebrate and venerate these qualities. And then in bold, because this is an important point, Rinpoche then says, from the Dharma point of view, the true purpose of respect is to connect mind to mind through pure, inner, substanceless qualities in order to develop pure outer substance qualities, which again create more pure inner substanceless qualities. So when we have an appreciation for a sublime individual or for the Dharma, this is where we connect on the basis of faith that is pure. That leads us to engage further with body, speech, and mind, and that again deepens this experience of that which is pure, inner, substanceless qualities. So Rinpoche quotes the Buddha, who said, all existent phenomena are naturally in mind. Mind is primary and exists before the actions of body and speech. Whoever speaks and acts with pure mind is always happy, just as shadows never separate from their source. So this is important because, particularly in the modern context, we very often just think mind, well, it's this sort of unseen thing, you know, and it's sort of just left unexplained. But it is really what rules us, and it was rules our then actions of body and speech. So it is primary, and it is what lies behind gestures of respect with body and speech. This is what we know. For example, in a toxic context, then we have the notion of passive aggression, where somebody might be very gentle, but we know there's anger behind. There's aggression that lies behind. This is also where we had, what was it, Adi Lang in the 1960s. He had this is a psychologist who developed this concept of the double bind, which is he identified as being very problematic when persons they say something, or they physically might sort of say something, but there's an ambiance and there's something behind. And this, particularly in the case of child psychology, was important in terms of diagnosing how sometimes kids would be very anxious because they would have grown-ups that sort of said particular things, but yet underneath the children would sense anger and so forth. So there would be this condition he called double bind. And that's where we can see really mind is primary beyond just the gestures of body and speech. So that's where we, who are onto this then, we need to continually scrutinize our mind before making gestures of respect. We might just make empty gestures of respect. There has to be something genuine behind, especially if we're engaging with sublime persons. Then it's very obvious to them, but it's also to our own detriment if there's not genuine attitude behind the gestures. So that's where we talk about genuine, the genuine. But there's also that which just becomes then cultural or traditional rigid practices. So that's where it really could just become behavior. And that's where we just have empty gestures, empty rigid traditions of behavior. And that's where people they react, they become rebellious, and they prompts disrespect to the extent really that they actually people lose the vehicle that could take them to something which is pure. And so on the basis of the rigidity of traditions, then what really the tradition intended is lost. And those who react against it, they no longer have any way of accessing this purity. So if we have inner good intention, then we have continuous pure respect. So if we have this connectedness through spiritual discipline or practice, then there is naturally an awareness that takes us beyond just the hollow external behaviorist aspects of our gestures of respect, and our gestures naturally become expressions of pure respect. So now Rinpoche talks about various styles, and this is where Rinpoche then in this sort of incredible poetic prose manner sort of highlights the comedy of the different traditions that we might have. The outer gestures, they can respect, they can vary. So that's where, for example, we could have a disciplined formal style, which is then disrespectful to open-minded, relaxed style. This, of course, is something that Rinpoche was very privy to. This in the, you could say, the interaction between persons who come from monastic or somewhat formalized education in Buddhism that would come to encounter these sort of alternative counterculture students of Buddhism in the 1970s and 80s, and the clash between these two. Not deeply, but still, nevertheless, there's some misunderstanding takes place. And in general, also, when we fail, there's very often sort of the notion of formal distant style. That's disrespectful to close, intimate style, right? Two people, somebody very open-minded, somebody very close and open to someone who then meets them with a formal, distant kind of style. But of course, they both just come from their own particular, you could say, traditions of respect. So that's where there has to be sensitivity that goes beyond just the rigid patterns of behavior. Rinpoche also highlights how then sometimes verbose, complex language of scholars, this can be disrespectful to the clear, natural speech of saints or sages. So Rinpoche says, if we do not practice Dharma, but only talk continuously without faith in our teacher, his teachings, his empowerments, our practice, and our retreat, making a Dharma shopping list, then our impure minds become constipated and we get Dharmaroids, which is disrespectful to the true Dharma practitioner and to pure Dharma. So, in fact, we could do all the right things, but if they're just rigid gestures, then we just become rigid, constipated, and we get Dharmaroids. You can figure that out for yourself what that might be if you have ever had a bout of Dharmaroids. Anyway, this goes contrary to true Dharma, being a true Dharma practitioner, contrary to the true Dharma. So this, of course, is something that these kind of, you could say, way that we perceive, what is respectful is so often different. It so differs, the difference between burping in Morocco and burping in Buckingham Palace and so on, and also Dharma culture, also very different. If you You bring, you know, sometimes I think, you know what, actually Dharma culture sometimes is very, very tolerant, surprisingly. Sometimes you have Vajrayana practitioners that go into very sacred Dharma sites that are visited by Buddhists from all different Dharma cultures, and they do their elaborate Vajrayana practice. And so different from some of the other traditions, right? And some of the other traditions might just think, you know, it's disrespectful, but then again, there's a surprising sort of a surprising degree of accommodation, actually, in my experience. But yes, the various Dharma, you know, the attitudes to women, the attitudes to sensuality, the whole notion of whether enlightenment is for oneself or for all sentient beings, etc., very different in the different cultures, right? So respect can be something very relative. Rinpoche says, Dharma's respect, which depends on our limitless wisdom mind, is disrespectful to samsara's respect, which depends on dualistic mind. If we always respect samsara's way, we cannot release our rigid, limited mind into true, respectful, pure light qualities. But temporarily, as long as we have the phenomenon of relative truth, without respecting samsara's customs, we cannot reveal Dharma's way. So genuine commitment to the wisdom of the Dharma goes beyond the ordinary belief systems of dualistic mind, of samsara. And we could never achieve enlightenment if we just stick with the ordinary belief systems of samsara. But then again, we temporarily have to be respectful within samsara. And for us to actually engage with the genuine nature of the path, there has to be respect for the phenomenal world, the relative truth. So that's where we can't just all of a sudden do our own thing. We have to respect and be not aggressive and kindly, considerately respect the customs of samsara. And it's through doing that then we'll discover that which lies beyond the ordinary, you could say, gross aspects of samsaric culture. That's where we, unless we actually abide by the relative truth, we won't actually understand absolute truth. Rinpoche says, if we want to truly show respect, the best practice is to accept a doctrine complementary to our faculties until we have transformed conceptualization into wisdom manifestation. Heavy gross elements disrespect, to light subtle elements respect, beyond both disrespect and respect, into our pure secret essence. So that's where the greatest form of respect is then through us, you say, being true to the Dharma within. And it's through that then all the sort of ordinary concepts on the basis of the skillful means of our path, they then are purified. And that's where we go beyond any kind of notion of subject and object, and someone that is respectful to something. Tradition. There is no communication in relative truth without understanding everyone's system and idea. So may I adapt to everyone's system, wishing for everyone's benefit. There is no liberation in absolute truth without release from everyone's system and idea. So may I adapt to no one's system beyond benefit's wish. So this continues the theme that we were just touching on, namely the two truths. So relative truth, we need to adapt to the ways of the world. In absolute truth, we should never be caught by the narrowness of the belief systems and practices of the world. Is there any difference or relationship between respect and faith? Yeah, a lot. We're going to look at this. I think this comes in this chapter here. We'll see actually. But yes, because respect really is the place where we're open to something. We're open to something, the Dharma, someone, the sublime beings, or in ordinary secular context, we're open to somebody, and that comes from us actually perceiving qualities that are beyond the obvious and the manifest, and that's where we have faith. This quality of trust. This is what we call faith. So that is, you say, very much tied up with respect. Yeah. So this will come in this chapter here. So here at the beginning of the chapter, Rinpoche writes, in the whole universe, no one can agree on one tradition, but all beings, from small insects to sublime practitioners, depend on some tradition to reach their aim. Without different traditions to choose from, there can be no basis for understanding or association among beings. There can only be obstacles, chaos, and misery. Although different groups follow different traditions, all traditions depend on the energy of the 5 elements and appear through different combinations of gross and subtle complementary elements. But because every tradition has its own individual energy, which corresponds to beings' individual faculties, it is difficult for beings to cross from one tradition to another. So wonderful. So we all need tradition in the sense that we need structure. So this is what we talked about earlier in terms of us engaging in systems. But yeah, and we can't actually do with that without we having, both in terms of the Dharma, but also in terms of ordinary secular context, there has to be some way, some cohesion, societal, cultural cohesion for us to actually succeed and survive as societies. This is then what we can call traditions. So these different traditions, as we can see, whether it's traditions in Papua New Guinea, or whether it's traditions within the cultures of modernity, all of them operate with the subtle element of their psychology, the subtle elements, and the outer world, the 5 elements. But because of the way and the belief systems of these different cultures, there's different ways of relating then to the both the gross, you could say material, and the subtle, the psychological. Every tradition on the basis of the, you could say, existing patterns of these traditions, and also on the basis of the psychological disposition that these cultures, they have their own particular ways of doing things. And that's why it's very different when people from different traditions, they meet. So so it's, we can't disassociate ourselves, you know, even within modernity. And there's been all this sort of the whole, you could say, rebellion against systems and societies and et cetera, and traditions, yeah. Then everyone actually, regardless of what they call it, they subscribe and they belong to some sort of culture, subculture, tradition of one sort or another. And all of these, they speak different languages. They have different values. So it's not always that they understand each other. Rinpoche gives a very sweet example of spiders who live alone and their particular tradition, which might be incompatible with ants' tradition. Spider entering into large ant hill might not really get along with the spiders in there. He makes a disclaimer with regards to, I think it was giant African ant. Anyway, so that's where, again, we understand this relativity, where what is polite in one culture or tradition might be rude in another. I think we were talking about burping. So the only way forward, that is to be sensitive to the various traditions that where we encounter. So that's where, again, this non-aggression is so important. So the ultimate Dharma, the ultimate truth, that lies beyond any tradition. So that's why we have the skillful means of the Dharma, which adapt according to particular cultures and particular traditions. Yet Dharma ultimately, beyond the skillful means, the wisdom of the Dharma lies beyond any tradition. It is beyond anything that can be conceptualized, objectified, diminished, or reduced into language or expression of any kind. So that wisdom is completely intangible. So that's beyond tradition. But for ordinary people, it needs to be communicated. It needs to be taught so that it inspires faith according to the tradition of the audience. And that's also today Tonsei Khyentse Rinpoche was talking about then the need for marketing, you know, sort of avoiding any kind of, you could say, pompous language, any pompous Buddhist language. He just was referring to it as marketing. But that is, of course, the skillful means that enables to meet people where they actually are. Rinpoche says, ultimately, for the purpose of enlightenment, we must acknowledge traditionalist wisdom clear space, which is the source of all countless traditions. But temporarily, while our faculties are obscured, we cannot reject tradition. It is Dharma tradition to say that in order to lead to enlightenment, the Buddha's teaching adapts to worldly customs. Keen, pure element faculties always reflect pure Dharma. But those with obstructed impure element faculties cannot adapt to pure Dharma, so they must rely on the traditions of faith until they develop keen faculties. So this is where we talked about, there was this question about faith before. We're going to look at faith because there is the objective of all of Dharma, if you like. The purpose of enlightenment is to penetrate to what has nothing to do with Buddhism or any kind of culture, which is entirely traditionalist, which is wisdom, clear space, that which is undiluted, unconditional, the ground beyond notions of samsara and nirvana. And it's from there everything arises. But then on the basis of the various dispositions of deluded, confused sentient beings that fail to understand wisdom, clear space, then there is the various traditions, and that's why we cannot reject these traditions as long as we want to succeed, either in a secular or in a dharmic context. And that's why when we engaged with the teaching, it's something that ultimately points us to the ultimate wisdom, clear space. And those with keen, pure faculties recognize this, recognize the value of this. This is also where we talk about merit. Rinpoche today was talking about how merit is really the natural gestures that arise out of awareness, those for whom there are keen awareness of this pure elements, then naturally their actions engage with that dimension. And this is what we then call merit, as opposed to just, you could say, good karma, positive, or actions that create particular agreeable circumstances. Then there are actions which connect us to freedom, to an awakening. There are those who are not sensitive in that way. So that's where, then again, they need other skillful means. But universally across the board, there has to be this appreciation of what the Dharma really represents in terms of purity. And that's where then there is a path which is based on faith in the value of Dharma. The value of faith in the value of the path, which is this ultimate faith in the value of the path. Wisdom talks about this fanatic faith. This is the blind faith that may work. This is where someone says this rock is a deity, and then we pray, it might work. And it's natural positive feeling when we come across Dharma culture. There's something that just touches us within. And then there's irreversible, you could say reasonable faith, Rinpoche calls it, which is this undeniable, irreversible understanding of the nature of Dharma on the basis of us actually understanding, reflecting, and using reasoning. So faith, that is where we trust something beyond the appearance. That's where we understand the phenomenon's inconspicuous nature. So this is where we have this in our relationship to people, and we have this also in relation to sublime qualities. So that is faith is an ability. In fact, it's one of the seven, we could say the seven wealth of a bodhisattva. It's the first of the seven wealths of a bodhisattva. Pakpan Nordun, the seven sublime qualities. That's faith. That is actually having the intelligence that can see inconspicuous qualities in persons, also in phenomena. So that's the faith and the love that we might have for someone or something that is dependent on our intention, that we connect with something that rings true to us. So we need to rely on tradition, as we've seen, in order to be effective. And the objective of our, and as the objective of our tradition is enlightenment, we need faith. In the case of us being Buddhists, we see that in general, we need traditions for us to succeed. And then particularly then, as Buddhists, then we need to have a path, a skillful means. So for that, we need faith. We need to understand where this is going. Even if we don't have a complete certainty, there's just some resonance. And that's where Rinpoche was talking about this thing called clear faith. Even if we might not have complete certainty about the nature of enlightenment, just having the, just being drawn to it. Like he said, when we come into a temple and we just feel drawn to all the various images, even though we might not understand what they are. Of course, some need more or less traditions. Some might need more or less institutions. But tradition is what enables us really to work with our communities. Problem is when the conspicuous aspect of we say the material gross elements, they are so, you could say, key to the focus. So for example, just material security. When that is so important, and the values of that which is beyond material security, the spiritual, when that is lost and there's just focus on the material and the security, then that becomes this rigidity where we fear losing losing that which is in fact subject to change, like Rinpoche said before. You know, these gross material aspects, they change, they're impermanent. So ultimately, we recognize that Dharma enables us to connect with something which is beyond any structure whatsoever. So that which is beyond tradition, and this is what we intuit then through faith. Rinpoche says the Dharma point of view is to try to destroy samsara's tradition through wisdom expressions of skillful means, such as writing, painting, speaking, or teaching to reach enlightenment, which is beyond tradition. Even so, many generations of artists, philosophers, and teachers have always expressed themselves in the same traditional style. If we write or paint or say something that is not too close to tradition, some rigid Buddhists think that it is not the Buddhist point of view. They do not understand that the Buddhist tradition is to break samsara's impure traditions to attain the vastest, purest traditions. Traditions always make limits if it is not pure. So from the beginning, we should have no attachment to tradition in order to release our mind from the habit of samsara's traditional trap. So everything we have in the Buddhist teaching in terms of art, in terms of writing, it's just pointing, like the Buddha pointing to the moon. These are just fingers that point to the moon. We shouldn't get stuck on the finger. So that's why all these various ways that we have in the Buddhist tradition, they point to that which goes beyond tradition. And yet there might be those who are very stuck on how the finger is represented, and that's of course the rigidity, that's the danger. But this is where there's some misunderstanding. So that's where we need to understand the purpose of Dharma as being pure and beyond such limitations. We can see that Dharma is in a way a project of deprogramming. It is the vessel that takes us across the ocean, and the purpose of the Dharma is to arrive at the other side, not to be attached to the vessel itself. And then Rinpoche gives over several pages a delightful, just amusing how the juxtaposition between what kind of agenda we have. So this is me just summing it up, but of course you should, it's just delightful reading really, where if we as ordinary artists, or he then uses this example of philosophers or monks or yogis or meditators, if we just have mere limited intention, if we're stuck within the external framework, then if that's all we want, and if that really constitutes where we feel safe, we want to have art, we want to create art that falls within the parameters of our particular intention, which might be material or might be having recognition or might find safety within a particular context, and likewise also with philosophy, monks, etc., etc. If that's our intention, then yes, then the traditions of limited growth phenomena serve us just fine. That's our rather unimaginative agenda, then this will serve us. If we aspire to apply art, philosophy, the spiritual path, etc., in order to become sublime individuals, in order to eliminate our limitations and our confusions, then we need this limitless tradition of wisdom that goes beyond ordinary gross traditions. So that's where the path will lead us beyond the path. The tradition of Dharma, the pure tradition of wisdom, will lead us beyond these gross traditions, narrow, limited traditions. So Rinpoche says, if as meditators we have the limited intention to only express silent forms within the limits of our breathing, which we inhale and exhale through our limited karmic bodies' obscured nostrils, then it is all right for us to be always bound by the limited space of our traditional cushions and to be reborn as nearly silent cows, except for an occasional moo. If we have the vast intention to be sublime meditators, then we must release our mind from concentration and relax in infinite, natural, clear awareness, spaceless space. Whatever conceptions of existence and non-existence arise, we can release them until our thoughts, like self-liberated cloud knots, become light ornaments of traditionalist display. Okay. Any questions? Going back a bit, emotions seemed tempered or mitigated with awareness. They dissipate, maybe go away altogether. Is it ideal to always relate our emotions with awareness? What is the relationship between emotions and awareness? Yes, that's what we're doing with the practice of the Dharma. We're going beyond the ordinary limitations and the habitual patterns of our emotions. And so, yes, awareness, yes, it tampers with, it mitigates, it, you could say, destroys or whatever. It frees us. Because what really emotions are is ignorance. So they're essentially the ministers and the messengers and the politicians of ignorance. So the moment that we sort of switch on the light of awareness, they're actually exposed as just being rather powerless little golems that manage to somehow delude us because they fester in the darkness of ignorance. But in fact, when we switch on the light, then they have no power. So that's where you could say the strength of the emotions is lost with awareness. But it should also be said that essentially emotions, when why they become so, you could say, pathetic, is because they're really the natural display of our intelligence that are limited and filtered through ignorance, through ego, or through unawareness. And that's where then they become diminished, and they just operate then as you could say, the ministers or henchmen or whatever of ignorance. And that's where, when these are no longer filtered through unawareness, and when there is awareness, then there's a possibility that these ordinary emotions, they then arise as non-dual display, and that's where we can then talk about wisdom. Thinley Norbu Rinpoche's analysis of phenomena is somehow like a Sangha's Abhidhamma Samuccaya. Each and every aspect of phenomena is described, leaving nothing aside. We can just admire. I'll take your word for it. Yeah. Yes, just the other day I came across a great quote, which I really liked. It was from Carl Rogers. He said, "Facts are friendly." And so if we see phenomena for what they are, yes, we can admire. Yeah. Rinpoche's writing is truly like dancing with words magically. It truly is. It is. Regarding energy, according to worldly custom, it is best to keep energy contained without expressing it until we get results. Could you please explain more about this sentence? Shouldn't we work hard at the beginning? Is keep energy here similar to keep inner calm? Well, it's more that conventional wisdom that tells us if you're starting a new business, then to not waste all the energy in terms of what you hope the business might become or what you might dream it could be, and so on. And that's why we very often, when we blurt, then we fail to actually contain the energy that's potentially there. And that's not just dharmic. I mean, it's actually a sound knowledge of the invisible and the unseen, but it's on a rather folksy level. It's quite secular, and it is generally just, you could say, very often that in a worldly context, people who are inscrutable are very successful. So you could say it has something to do with keep inner calm, but it's more about just not squandering the energy. These teachings are so timely. Deep gratitude to Thinley Rinpoche. Yeah, for sure. Somebody told me that for the first few years of their Dharma life, they kept this book with them all the time, like a Bible. I just can't help but think that is so wonderful. Because even if there would have been some things that obviously were a bit mysterious, man, it would create such a good and very sophisticated, provocative, you could say, food for thought as one then engaged with the study and practice of the path. So rejoicing in that. Yeah. All right, we'll conclude here. So next time, please read the last chapters of the book. I apologize for slight delay in the plan, but I don't think anybody really minds that we've gone 1 or 2 weeks further than initially projected. But next time, November 4th, for that, please read then the end of the book, chapters Art, Isolation, and Meditation Practice. By this accumulation of merit, may I obtain all-seeing omniscience, and may all faults be defeated. The whirling, turbulent waves of birth, aging, sickness, and death. From this ocean of samsara, may I liberate beings. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Ever absorbed in the display of divine forms and primordial awareness, appearance, sound, and perception in the state of divinities, mantras, and dharmakaya, may I, inseparable from the practice of this profound and secret great yoga, attain within the essence of mind the state of one taste. Thank you.